The steer bolted like hellfire had caught its tail, dragging two grown men through the mud before their ropes snapped like thread. Nathan Hale watched his best hands stumble to their feet, cursing, while 1,000 pounds of terrified beef thundered toward the canyon edge. One more step and he'd lose the animal, and possibly a man trying to save it. Then a rope sang through the air, clean and true, and the steer jerked to a halt 3 feet from the drop. Nathan turned to see who'd made the throw. His foreman's jaw went slack. That's a woman. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Mara's story travels. And if you believe some rules are made to be broken, hit that like button and stay until the end. This is a story about a woman who refused to be anything less than extraordinary. The rope burned hot through Mara Cole's gloves as the steer fought against physics and her will. She'd wrapped the line twice around her saddle horn. A rookie would have tried to hold it by hand and lost fingers. And now she simply sat deep in the saddle, letting her mare do what 12 years of training had taught her. The horse planted her hooves and held. Easy, Mara murmured, though whether she meant the horse, the steer, or herself, she couldn't say. The animal's wild eye rolled white as it struggled, but the loop had settled perfect around its neck, just behind the jaw, where a good throw landed. Not too tight to choke, not too loose to slip. Mara had made that throw 1,000 times, and she'd make it 1,000 more before she was done with this life. If anyone would let her. The men were staring. She could feel their eyes like brands even before she turned her head. 6 ranch hands scattered across the muddy holding pen, their own ropes hanging useless, their faces ranging from shocked to skeptical to something that looked uncomfortably like anger. The foreman, a barrel-chested man named Tom Wardell, with a beard that hid most of his expression, was the first to move. He strode through the mud with his boots making sucking sounds, his eyes fixed on Mara like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. That was a good throw. Mara touched the brim of her hat, keeping her face neutral. Just doing the job, sir. The job. Wardell's tone suggested he had opinions about women and jobs and the proper intersection of the two. Right. Well, get that steer into the north pen before he tries something else stupid. She nodded and nudged her mare forward, keeping the line taut as she maneuvered the steer away from the canyon edge. The animal had given up fighting now, its sides heaving, its brief burst of freedom over. Mara knew the feeling. Behind her, she heard the murmur of male voices, low and speculative. She'd heard those tones before, on every ranch she'd worked in the 3 years since she'd lost everything. Men didn't know what to make of a woman who could rope and ride and work cattle with the best of them. Some were impressed. Some were threatened. Most were both. She didn't care anymore. She'd learned to live with their stares, their whispers, their occasional crude suggestions. What mattered was the work. The work was clean and honest, and it didn't lie. You were good enough or you weren't. The rope caught or it didn't. Everything else was noise. Mara guided the steer into the pen and dismounted to remove her rope. The animal trotted away, already forgetting its near-death experience, already thinking about hay and water and the simple pleasures of being a steer. She coiled the rope with practiced efficiency, checking for wear as she worked. The hemp was getting thin in places. She'd need to replace it soon, which meant another expense, another calculation of what she could afford versus what she needed. The story of her life lately. Miss Cole. The voice was different from the others, quieter, more measured. Mara turned to find a man standing a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. He was tall, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples, despite looking no older than 35. His clothes were well made but worn from use, not for show. His eyes were gray, steady, and intelligent. Nathan Hale, the owner. She'd seen him from a distance when she'd arrived at Northridge Ranch that morning, answering the general call for day workers to help with a difficult gather. She hadn't expected him to speak to her directly. Owners rarely did. Mr. Hale? She kept her voice level, professional. That was exceptional work just now. He gestured toward the canyon edge. Most men would have hesitated. The steer would be dead. Mara shrugged slightly. The rope was already in my hand. Just seemed wasteful to let good beef go over. A slight smile touched his mouth. Practical. I try to be. He studied her for a moment, and Mara forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. She'd learned early that men respected you more if you didn't look away first, even when their attention made your skin crawl. Though Hale's attention didn't feel threatening, it felt measuring, like he was weighing something carefully. Tom tells me you hired on this morning for day work, he said finally. Yes, sir. Where did you learn to rope like that? The question was casual, but Mara heard the real inquiry underneath. Where did a woman learn skills that most men struggled to master? The answer was complicated and painful, and she had no intention of sharing it with a stranger. My father taught me, she said simply. He believed skill mattered more than circumstance. Something shifted in Hale's expression, recognition perhaps, or understanding. Your father was a wise man. Was, Mara confirmed, keeping her voice flat. He's been dead 3 years. I'm sorry. The words sounded genuine, which somehow made them worse. Mara nodded once and turned her attention back to her rope, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. She didn't need pity. She'd had enough pity to last a lifetime, and it had never once put food on her plate or a roof over her head. But Hale didn't leave. I'm looking for skilled hands, he said instead. Full-time work. The pay is standard wage, but I'm willing to go double for exceptional talent. Mara's hand stilled on the rope. Double wage. That was more money than she'd seen in months. Enough to finally replace her worn saddle. Enough to stop sleeping in haylofts and rented rooms that smelled like mildew and broken dreams. Enough to maybe, possibly, start saving towards something more permanent than survival. But there was always a catch. She looked up at him, searching his face for the ulterior motive. Why? Hale blinked. Why what? Why would you pay me double? She gestured toward the other ranch hands. Those men are skilled. They've probably been working cattle since before I was born. Why pay me more? Because you're better than they are. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Mara wanted to argue, wanted to deflect, wanted to do anything except acknowledge the truth of what he'd said, but she'd never been good at lying, especially to herself. They won't like it, she said quietly. Probably not. Some of them might quit. That's their choice. Mara studied him more carefully. Nathan Hale didn't strike her as a man who made impulsive decisions. He had the deliberate air of someone who thought things through, who weighed consequences before acting, which meant he'd already considered the problems that hiring her would cause, and he decided to do it anyway. The question was why. What's the real reason? She asked bluntly. And please don't tell me it's just because I'm good with a rope. Men don't pay women double wage out of pure admiration for skill. For the first time, Hale looked uncomfortable. He glanced away toward the distant mountains that ringed his property, then back at her. You want honesty? Always. I'm tired of watching talent go to waste because of stupid prejudices. My father built this ranch by hiring the best people he could find, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like or whether they fit someone's narrow idea of normal. He met her eyes again. I watched him turn away a Chinese man who could break horses like he was whispering secrets to them, all because the other hands threatened to quit. He regretted it for the rest of his life, said it was the moment he chose comfort over principle, and he never forgave himself. Mara felt something crack open in her chest, some small defended space where she'd locked away hope. So you're hiring me to ease your conscience? The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but Hale didn't flinch. I'm hiring you because you're the best hand I've seen in 5 years, and I'm paying you what you're worth. If that eases my conscience, it's a side benefit. The honesty was startling. Mara wasn't used to employers who admitted their motivations, who acknowledged that principle and pragmatism could coexist. She wasn't used to being valued for her skill rather than tolerated despite it. She should say yes. She knew she should say yes. The work was good, the pay was better than good, and winter was coming. This might be her only chance at steady employment before the snow fell and the hiring stopped. But old wounds ran deep. I need to think about it, she heard herself say. Hale nodded slowly. Fair enough, but I need an answer by tomorrow morning. We're starting the gather in 3 days, and I need to know who's on my crew. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back. For what it's worth, Miss Cole, I don't make offers I'm not serious about. If you take this job, you'll be treated the same as every other hand on this ranch. No better, no worse. You'll earn your keep, same as them, and if you prove yourself, there'll be more opportunities down the line. Then he was gone, striding back toward the main house with the easy confidence of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. Mara stood in the mud, her rope coiled over her shoulder, watching him go. Around her, the other ranch hands had returned to work. Though she could feel their sideways glances, their whispered speculation. They knew something had happened, they just didn't know what. Neither did she, really. Double wage, full-time work. A chance to prove herself on one of the largest, most respected ranches in eastern Oregon. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. Mara rode into town as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. Ridgeway wasn't much. A main street, a handful of stores, 2 saloons, and a bank that looked far too prosperous for a town this size. But it had a boarding house that rented rooms by the week, and Mrs. Chen, who ran it, didn't ask questions as long as the rent came on time. She stabled her mare at the livery, paying the hostler his fee and ignoring his raised eyebrows when she insisted on checking the hay and water herself. She'd learned not to trust other people's standards when it came to caring for her horse. The mare was more than transportation. She was partner, companion, and sometimes the only living thing that seemed to give a damn whether Mara lived or died. "You did good today, girl," Mara murmured, running her hand down the mare's neck. "Real good." The horse whickered softly and turned her attention to her feed. Satisfied, Mara shouldered her saddlebags and headed for the boarding house. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen when Mara arrived, stirring something that smelled like heaven and made Mara's stomach cramp with hunger. She'd eaten nothing since dawn except some jerky and hardtack, too focused on work to stop for a proper meal. "Miss Cole," Mrs. Chen looked up with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had the presence of someone much larger. "Good day?" "Might have been." Mara set her saddlebags down. "Is my room still available?" "Always, as long as you pay." Mrs. Chen's English carried the musical lilt of her native Cantonese, but her meaning was always crystal clear. "You look hungry. Sit, eat." It wasn't really a request. Mara had learned that Mrs. Chen viewed feeding people as both business and moral obligation, and arguing was pointless. She sat at the worn kitchen table while Mrs. Chen ladled soup into a bowl, something rich with vegetables and chunks of chicken that made Mara want to weep with gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mrs. Chen waved the thanks away. "You work hard. You need food. Simple." If only everything were that simple. Mara ate slowly, trying not to shovel the soup down like a starving animal despite her body's demands. Mrs. Chen worked at the stove, giving her space but maintaining a companionable presence. It was one of the things Mara appreciated about the older woman. She understood the value of silence, of letting people be without demanding conversation or explanation. "Someone at Northridge Ranch offers you job today," Mrs. Chen said after a while. It wasn't a question. Mara looked up, startled. "How did you—" "Tom Wardell's wife. She comes to market this afternoon. She tells me Nathan Hale is thinking to hire a woman for full-time work. She's not happy about this." Mrs. Chen's expression was neutral, but her eyes held understanding. "Only one woman working Northridge today." Of course. Small towns had no secrets. Whatever decision Mara made, everyone would know by morning. "He offered double wage," Mara admitted. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. "This is unusual." "That's what I thought." "But you don't say yes right away." Mara set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone despite her hunger. "I've had offers before, Mrs. Chen. Good offers. They always come with strings attached." The older woman studied her for a long moment. Then she came to the table and sat down across from Mara, her small hands folded in front of her. "I tell you story," she said. "When I come to this country, I am young. I speak no English. My husband, he brings me to California to work on railroad. They tell us we can make good life, have opportunity. You know what we find?" Mara shook her head. "We find men who work us like animals, who pay us half what they pay white workers, who beat my husband when he complains about safety, who look at me like I am not human. Mrs. Chen's voice remained calm, matter of fact, but Mara could hear the old pain underneath. My husband dies in tunnel collapse. Company says he is careless. They give me nothing. I'm sorry, Mara whispered. I am sorry too. But I tell you this because after he dies, I have choice. I can believe all men are liars, all promises are traps. I can hide and survive and never trust anyone again. She paused. Or I can look at each person, each situation, and decide for myself. Not based on fear, based on what I see with my own eyes. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong, and I survive anyway, like I always have. Mrs. Chen reached across the table and patted Mara's hand. Fear is good. Fear keeps us alive. But fear that stops us from living? That is just another kind of dying. Mara felt something loosen in her throat, some knot she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. What if I fail? She asked quietly. What if I take the job and I can't do it? Or the men make it impossible? Or then you leave. You find another job. You survive. Mrs. Chen's smile was gentle. You are very good at surviving, Miss Cole. Maybe it is time to be good at something more. Mara lay awake that night in her narrow rented room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. Someone snored down the hall. Outside, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The wind rattled the window frame, carrying the first whisper of autumn cold. She thought about her father. Thomas Cole had been a small rancher, the kind of man who believed in hard work and fair dealing and the essential goodness of people even when they proved him wrong. He'd taught Mara everything he knew about cattle and horses and land management, not because he thought she'd need it, but because he believed knowledge was valuable for its own sake. Never let anyone tell you what you can't do, girl, he'd said 100 times, 1,000. You show them what you can do and let that speak for itself. She'd tried. After he died and the bank foreclosed on the ranch, claimed he'd missed payments, produced papers she'd never seen, legal documents that might as well have been written in a foreign language. She'd tried to keep going. She'd thought skill would be enough, thought competence would open doors. She'd been young and stupid and painfully naive. The first rancher who hired her had seemed decent enough, right up until he'd cornered her in the barn and made it clear what he expected in exchange for employment. When she'd kneed him in the groin and left, he'd spread word that she was a troublemaker, unreliable, not worth the hassle. The second rancher had been smarter. He'd never touched her, never said anything actionable. He'd just worked her twice as hard as the men, paid her half as much, and fired her the moment she'd complained. No explanation, no recourse. The third had simply refused to believe a woman could do the work, no matter how many times she proved it. He'd kept her on for exactly 2 weeks before deciding she was too much of a distraction for his crew. After that, Mara had stopped expecting anything except temporary work and suspicion. She'd learned to keep her head down, do the job, take the pay, and move on before things could get complicated. It had kept her alive. It had kept her moving. But Mrs. Chen was right. It wasn't living. It was just a slower form of dying. Nathan Hale's offer hung in her mind like a rope thrown across a chasm. She could grab it and see if it held, or she could let it fall and keep walking the path she knew. Safe, predictable, slowly suffocating. Mara closed her eyes and made her decision. Bam! She arrived at Northridge Ranch as the sun crested the eastern hills, painting the landscape in shades of gold and shadow. The ranch sprawled across a broad valley, with the main house sitting on a slight rise overlooking corrals, barns, bunkhouses, and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. Cattle dotted the distant fields, dark shapes against the pale grass. It was beautiful. It was everything her father's ranch had been, before the banks took it. Nathan Hale was standing near the main corral, talking with Tom Wardle. Both men looked up as Mara approached, and she saw Wardell's expression shift from neutral to something harder, more resistant. She ignored him and focused on Hale. "I'll take the job," she said without preamble. "Double wage, full-time work, same treatment as every other hand." Those were the terms. Hale's face didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested satisfaction. "Those were the terms," he confirmed. "Welcome to Northridge, Miss Cole," He extended his hand. Mara shook it, feeling the rough calluses that marked him as a working owner, not someone who just watched from a distance. His grip was firm but not crushing, respectful without being tentative. Tom will show you the bunkhouse and get you settled, Hale continued. We start the gather at dawn tomorrow, so you'll want to check your gear tonight. Wardell looked like he'd swallowed something sour, but he nodded. Follow me, Miss Cole. As they walked away, Mara heard one of the other hands mutter something low and crude. Wardell's head whipped around. You got something to say, Jenkins. Say it to my face. Jenkins, a weathered man with tobacco-stained teeth, met Wardell's glare. Just wondering why we need to hire women when there's plenty of men who need work. Mr. Hale makes the hiring decisions, Wardell said flatly. You got a problem with that? Take it up with him. Otherwise, shut your mouth and do your job. Jenkins subsided, but the resentment in his eyes was clear. Mara kept her expression neutral, her shoulders straight. This was what she'd expected. This was the price of the opportunity. She'd paid worse. The bunkhouse was rougher than she'd hoped. A long, low building with a row of narrow beds, a few battered trunks, and a wood stove at one end. It smelled like sweat and tobacco, and the particular mustiness of places where men lived without much concern for cleanliness. Wardell gestured toward an empty bed in the corner. You can have that one. Breakfast is at 5. Work starts at first light. You'll want to... I know the routine, Mara interrupted gently. This isn't my first ranch. Wardell studied her for a moment. Right. Well, there's a lock on that trunk if you need it. Probably should use it. It was as close to kindness as she was likely to get from him. Mara nodded her thanks and set about organizing her meager belongings. She'd learned to travel light, changes of clothes, her rope and tools, a few personal items that were more sentimental than practical. Everything she owned fit in 2 saddlebags and a bedroll. The other hands trickled in as the day progressed, and Mara endured their stares and whispers with practiced indifference. A few nodded acknowledgement. Most ignored her. Jenkins made a point of spitting on the floor near her bunk before he walked away. She didn't react. Reaction was what men like Jenkins wanted, and she'd learned not to give them the satisfaction. By evening, the bunkhouse had settled into an uneasy truce. The hands gathered around the stove, playing cards and talking in low voices. Mara sat on her bunk, checking her rope and gear, trying to look occupied and unavailable for conversation. You really make that throw this morning, the one everyone's talking about? The voice came from a young man, barely 20, with a friendly face and curious eyes. He'd taken the bunk 2 down from hers, and he'd been one of the few who'd nodded greeting earlier. Mara looked up. Yeah, that's... He shook his head, grinning. That's something. I'm still working on getting my loop to land where I aim it. Half the time the steer's in the next county before I get close. Despite herself, Mara smiled slightly. Practice. That's all it is. I'm Danny. He stuck out his hand. Danny Wright. This is my 2nd season at North Ridge. She shook his hand. Mara Cole. I know, everyone knows. Danny's grin widened. You're the talk of the ranch. Half the hands think you're going to show us all up. Other half think you'll quit before the week's out. What do you think? I think anyone who can make Tom Wardell look impressed probably knows what they're doing. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. And between you and me, we could use someone who shakes things up around here. Gets boring sometimes. Mara found herself liking this earnest young man despite her better judgment. It might get more than boring if the others decide they don't want me here. Let him try. Danny's jaw set in a way that suggested he was tougher than he looked. Mr. Hale doesn't make stupid decisions. If he hired you, you deserve to be here. Anyone who can't handle that can leave. It was naive and optimistic and exactly the kind of thinking that got crushed in the real world. But it was also kind, and Mara hadn't experienced much kindness lately. Thanks, she said quietly. Danny nodded and went back to his own preparations, leaving Mara to her thoughts. Tomorrow would tell the tale. Tomorrow she'd either prove herself to these men, or she'd confirm every prejudice they already held. There was no middle ground, no room for error. She'd been in this position before, but this time felt different. This time she had an employer who'd put his money where his principles were. She had double wage and the chance to build something more than survival. And she had a memory of her father's voice, telling her to show them what she could do. Mara lay back on her bunk and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of men settling in for the night. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distance. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed softly, and a coyote called to the rising moon. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, she'd find out if Nathan Hale's faith was justified. Tomorrow, she'd prove that some rules were made to be broken, or she'd break trying. But tonight, for the first time in 3 long years, Mara Cole allowed herself to hope. The gather began before sunrise, when the world existed in shades of gray, and the stars still burned cold overhead. Mara saddled her mare in the pre-dawn darkness, her fingers working by memory and habit, while around her the other hands moved through their own preparations with the efficient silence of men who knew their work. Danny appeared at her elbow, his young face eager despite the early hour. "You'll be working the West Ridge with me and Cooper," he said quietly. "It's rough country up there. Lots of brush, some nasty ravines. Mr. Hale wants us to sweep it clean before the main herd gets pushed through." Mara nodded, checking her cinch one final time. Cooper was one of the older hands, a lean man with silver threading his dark hair and the cautious eyes of someone who'd seen trouble before. He'd been one of the ones watching her yesterday with what looked like skepticism rather than outright hostility. "Miss Cole," Cooper's voice was gravel and smoke, "you know how to work rough country." "I've worked rougher," she said simply. He grunted, which might have been approval or might have been doubt. "Stay close then. Easy to lose track of someone up there if they don't know the land." They rode out as the sky began to lighten in the east, 3 riders moving through the sage and juniper toward the rising slopes. The air smelled of dust and crushed grass, and the particular sharpness that came just before dawn. Mara's mare moved with steady confidence beneath her, and she let her body settle into the rhythm of the ride, feeling the old familiar peace that came from being on horseback with work ahead. The West Ridge rose in a series of steep folds, cut through with ravines where water ran in spring, but now held only shadows and the dry whisper of wind through stone. Scattered cattle grazed in the draws and hidden pockets, fat from summer grass, wary of the approaching riders. "We push them down slow," Cooper called back. "Don't rush them or they'll scatter into every crack and crevice, and we'll be up here till Christmas trying to root them out." Mara understood. Cattle were herd animals, but they were also individuals with their own stubborn ideas about where they wanted to be. Push too hard and they'd panic. Push too soft and they'd ignore you entirely. The trick was finding the balance, reading each animal's mood and adjusting accordingly. They spread out in a loose line and began working the slope, moving cattle down toward the valley floor with patience and steady pressure. It was skilled work, requiring constant attention to terrain, livestock, and the positions of the other riders. Mara found herself falling into the flow of it, her awareness expanding to encompass the whole operation, where the cattle wanted to go, where they needed to go, how to guide them without force. A cow and calf broke from the group, heading for a narrow ravine thick with brush. Without thinking, Mara urged her mare forward, cutting off their escape route and turning them back toward the herd with a sharp whistle and a wave of her rope. The cow considered fighting, then thought better of it and trotted back to join the others. "Nice work," Danny called, grinning. Cooper said nothing, but when Mara glanced his way, she caught what might have been the ghost of a nod. They worked through the morning as the sun climbed and the temperature rose, pushing cattle down from the high country in small groups that gradually merged into a larger herd. It was hot, dusty work that left Mara's throat dry and her shirt stuck to her back with sweat, but it was good work, the kind that required skill and attention rather than just brute strength. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat the cold biscuits and jerky they'd brought. Cooper found a patch of shade under a twisted juniper and settled against the trunk, studying Mara with those careful eyes. "You've done this before," he said finally. Not a question. "My father had a ranch," Mara replied, taking a long drink from her canteen. "Not as big as this, but big enough. I learned young." "What happened to it?" The question was direct but not unkind. Mara considered how much to share, weighing honesty against privacy. Something about Cooper's steady presence suggested he'd understand more than most. "Bank foreclosed," she said shortly, "after my father died. They said he owed money I never knew about. Had papers I'd never seen." Cooper's expression darkened. "Let me guess. Ridgeway Bank? Mara's head came up sharply. You know about them? Everyone knows about them, or they should. He spat into the dust. Samuel Garrett runs that bank like his own personal kingdom. Loans money to small ranchers at decent rates, then finds excuses to call the notes due early. Foreclosures, sales, consolidation. Half the land he owns used to belong to people who trusted him. The name hit Mara like a physical blow. Samuel Garrett. She'd seen that name on the foreclosure papers, signed in bold black ink below language she hadn't fully understood. She'd been 18 years old and newly orphaned, and the lawyer who'd explained the situation had used words like unfortunate and unavoidable, while his eyes had suggested she was wasting his time. He took everything, she said quietly. The land, the house, the cattle. Said it was all owed. I didn't know how to fight it. Didn't know I should try. Nothing you could have done, Cooper said, his voice rough with something that might have been anger or sympathy or both. Garrett's got judges in his pocket, lawyers on retainer. He's been doing this for 20 years, getting richer while good people lose what they built. Danny had been listening in silence, his young face troubled. But that's not legal, is it? You can't just steal people's land. It's legal enough if you've got the right papers and the right connections, Cooper said grimly. And Garrett's got both. Mara felt old rage stirring in her chest, the kind she'd learned to bury because it didn't help anything, didn't change what had happened. But knowing she wasn't alone, that others had suffered the same way, that there was a pattern and a name behind the loss, made the anger sharper, more focused. Why doesn't anyone stop him? She asked. Cooper's laugh was bitter. With what? Most of the people he ruins are barely scraping by to begin with. They don't have money for lawyers or influence or anything except their labor, and by the time they realize what's happening, it's too late. He paused, his eyes distant. My brother lost his place to Garrett 5 years back, hung himself in his barn 3 months later, left a wife and 2 kids with nothing. The words hung in the hot afternoon air, heavy with grief and helpless fury. Mara thought about her father, about the way grief and loss had hollowed him out in his final years, how he'd aged a decade in months after her mother died. The bank had just been the final blow, the thing that finished what sorrow had started. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Cooper shrugged, but his jaw was tight. It is what it is. We survive or we don't. That's the choice. They mounted up and returned to work, but something had shifted in the air between them. Cooper rode closer now, occasionally offering quiet advice about the terrain or pointing out cattle Mara might have missed. It wasn't friendship exactly, more like the beginning of respect, the acknowledgement that they'd both lost things to the same enemy. The afternoon wore on in a haze of heat and dust and the constant movement of cattle. Mara's body settled into the familiar ache of long hours in the saddle, muscles remembering rhythms they'd known since childhood. Her mare worked like an extension of her own will, responding to the slightest shift of weight or touch of rein. They were pushing the last group of cattle down a steep slope when Mara heard the shout. Run away! She looked up to see a young steer breaking from the herd, its eyes wild with panic as it bolted up the slope rather than down. Behind it, Jenkins was cursing and fighting with his horse, which had apparently spooked at something and was dancing sideways instead of pursuing. The steer was heading for a cliff edge hidden by brush and shadow. Mara could see it even if the animal couldn't. In seconds it would be over, falling to the rocks below. Her rope was in her hands before conscious thought caught up. She urged her mare into a gallop, angling to intercept the steer's path, her eyes measuring distance and speed and the rapidly shrinking window of opportunity. The ground was treacherous here, loose rock and hidden holes that could snap a horse's leg if you weren't careful. Mara didn't slow down. She could hear Cooper shouting something behind her, but the words were lost in the thunder of hooves and her own focused breathing. The steer was 10 feet from the cliff edge. 8, 6. Mara's rope sang through the air, the loop opening perfect, the throw guided by years of practice and muscle memory and something deeper than either. The loop settled around the steer's neck just as its front hooves touched the crumbling edge. Then everything happened at once. The rope pulled taut. The steer jerked back, bellowing. Mara's mare planted her feet and held, but the sudden weight and the treacherous ground were too much. The horse stumbled, going down on one knee, and Mara felt herself sliding sideways in the saddle, the world tilting at a sickening angle. She kicked free of the stirrups, not wanting to be trapped beneath a falling horse, and hit the ground hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. Pain shot through her left side, sharp and immediate. The steer was still fighting the rope, pulling Mara across the rocky ground toward the cliff edge she'd just saved it from. Through the haze of pain and panic, she heard pounding hooves. Strong hands grabbed her shoulders, pulling her back from the edge. Cooper's face swam into view, his expression grim. "Let go the rope," he ordered. "The steer. To hell with the steer. Let it go before it pulls you over." But the rope was wrapped around her saddle horn, and her saddle was still on her horse, which had regained its footing and was backing away from the cliff edge with the terrified intelligence of a creature that understood danger. The pressure on the rope eased as the mare's movement created slack. Danny appeared on the other side, grabbing the rope and adding his horse's strength to Mara's mare. Between them, they hauled the steer back from the edge, the animal finally giving up its fight and standing with heaving sides, its wild eye rolling. Mara tried to sit up and gasped as pain lanced through her ribs. Cooper's hands pressed her back down, gentle but firm. "Easy. Don't move yet." "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. "You're not fine. You just got dragged across rocks and nearly went over a cliff." Cooper's weathered face was tight with concern. "Can you breathe?" Mara took an experimental breath and immediately regretted it. The pain in her left side flared hot and sharp, making spots dance in her vision. "Ribs," she gasped. "Maybe cracked." "Maybe broken," Cooper corrected. He looked up at Danny. "Ride down and get Mr. Hale. Tell him we need the wagon." "I can ride," Mara protested, trying again to sit up. This time Cooper didn't push her down, but his hand stayed on her shoulder, steadying. "You could ride. You could also fall off your horse halfway down the mountain and break your neck. We're waiting for the wagon." There was steel in his voice that left no room for argument. Mara subsided, closing her eyes against the bright sky and the pain radiating through her torso. She could hear the steer being led away, still alive because she'd been fast enough and stupid enough to risk her own neck for it. Her father would have done the same thing. Would have said cattle were assets, investments, and you didn't let good beef die if you could prevent it. But he also would have lectured her for hours about taking unnecessary risks, about valuing her own safety as highly as the livestock's. She missed him with a sudden fierce ache that had nothing to do with her ribs. Cooper stayed with her while Danny rode for help, sitting in the dust with his hat tilted back and his eyes scanning the horizon. After a while, he spoke. "That was either the bravest thing I've seen or the stupidest. Haven't decided which yet." Despite the pain, Mara felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. "Can it be both?" "Usually is." He glanced down at her, his expression softer than she'd seen it. "You saved that steer. Saved Jenkins' ass too, since it was his job to keep the herd together. He won't thank you for it, but you did." "I wasn't thinking about Jenkins." "I know. You were thinking about the job, about doing it right." Cooper shook his head slowly. "You remind me of someone." "Your brother?" "My brother. My father. Every stubborn fool who ever thought principle mattered more than survival." His voice was rough but not unkind. "You're going to fit in here just fine, Miss Cole. The ones worth knowing will see what you're made of. The rest don't matter." Mara wanted to believe him, wanted to think that skill and courage would be enough to overcome prejudice and resentment, but she'd learned hard lessons about how the world worked, and optimism had been beaten out of her years ago. Still, lying in the dust with broken ribs and Cooper's gruff kindness, she felt something like hope stirring. The wagon arrived an hour later, Nathan Hale driving it himself with Danny riding alongside. Hale's face was set in hard lines as he climbed down and approached where Mara lay. "How bad?" he asked Cooper. "Ribs, maybe a few broken, got dragged some, banged up." Hale knelt beside Mara, his gray eyes serious as they met hers. "Can you tell me what happened?" Cooper answered before Mara could. "Steer spooked, headed for the cliff. She made the save but took a fall doing it, kept the animal from going over." "And nearly went over yourself," Hale added, his tone carefully neutral. "The steer's worth more than medical costs," Mara said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the pain. "It was good business." Something flickered in Hale's expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. "That's one way to look at it." He stood and gestured to Cooper and Danny. "Let's get her in the wagon. Careful with those ribs." They lifted her as gently as possible, but the movement still sent fire through her side. Mara bit down on a gasp and tasted blood where she'd cut her lip. By the time they had her settled in the wagon bed on a pile of blankets, she was shaking and cold despite the afternoon heat. Hale climbed into the driver's seat and took up the reins. "Cooper, you and Danny finish the gather. I'll take Miss Cole back to the ranch." "Want me to send for Doc Morrison?" Cooper asked. "Already sent word. He should be at the ranch by the time we get there." The wagon lurched into motion, and Mara closed her eyes against the jarring pain. She heard Hale speak to the horses, his voice low and steady, and then they were moving down the mountain at a careful pace that still felt like torture against her injured ribs. She must have drifted in and out of consciousness, because the next thing she knew clearly, they were pulling into the ranch yard and the sun had moved significantly across the sky. Voices surrounded her. Hale giving orders, someone else responding, and then she was being lifted again, carried into a building that smelled of clean linens and carbolic soap. "Easy now." A new voice, older and authoritative. "Let's have a look at you, young lady." Mara forced her eyes open to find a white-haired man with kind eyes and steady hands examining her ribs with professional efficiency. Doc Morrison, she assumed. His fingers probed carefully, and she hissed when he touched something that felt like broken glass grinding together. "3 cracked ribs," he announced. "Possible 4th. Lots of bruising. You're lucky you didn't puncture a lung." He began wrapping her torso with strips of cloth, pulling them snug but not tight. "You'll need to rest for at least 2 weeks. No riding, no heavy lifting, no—" 2 weeks? Mara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. "I can't. The gather will manage without you." Nathan Hale's voice came from somewhere behind the doctor. "You're no good to anyone with broken ribs and punctured lungs. But the job will be here when you're healed." Hale moved into her line of sight, his expression firm. "You're on medical leave, Miss Cole. Full pay, same as if you were working. When Doc Morrison clears you, you'll return to duty. Those are the terms." Mara stared at him, searching for the catch, the hidden cost. Men didn't pay workers to not work. They didn't hold positions for injured hands. They certainly didn't offer full wages for medical leave. "Why?" she asked bluntly. Hale's expression softened slightly. "Because you got hurt doing your job. Because those ribs need time to heal properly or they'll trouble you the rest of your life. And because I told you I'd treat you the same as every other hand on this ranch, and that includes medical leave when needed." "The others get medical leave?" "When they're injured in the line of duty, yes." He paused. "Last year, one of my men broke his leg in a fall. I paid him for 3 months while it healed and held his position open. The year before that, another hand got kicked by a horse and couldn't work for 6 weeks. Same arrangement." It was so far from Mara's experience of how ranchers operated that she didn't know how to respond. Every other employer had treated workers as replaceable, injuries as inconveniences that justified dismissal. The idea that Nathan Hale would actually stand behind his promises seemed almost too good to be true. Doc Morrison finished wrapping her ribs and stepped back, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "She'll need somewhere quiet to recover. Bunkhouse is no place for someone who needs rest." "I've already had a room prepared in the main house," Hale said. "Miss Cole will stay there until she's well enough to return to the bunkhouse." "The main house?" Mara's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "That's not— I can't—" "You can, and you will." Hale's tone left no room for argument. "There's a spare room on the ground floor with a good bed and privacy. Mrs. Granger, my housekeeper, will look after you. It's already arranged." Mara wanted to protest further, wanted to insist that she didn't need special treatment or charity or whatever this was. But the pain in her ribs was making it hard to think clearly, and the idea of trying to rest in the noisy, crowded bunkhouse made her want to weep with exhaustion. "Just until I'm healed," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just until you're healed," Hale agreed. "Now rest. Doctor's orders." Morrison left more instructions and a bottle of laudanum for the pain, then departed with promises to check on her in a few days. Hale stayed a moment longer, standing at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed and his expression thoughtful. "That was good work today," he said quietly. "Risky, but good. You saved a valuable animal and probably saved Jenkins from a reprimand for losing it. Jenkins won't see it that way, Mara murmured, her eyelids growing heavy. Jenkins can go to hell. The mild profanity was surprising coming from Hale's usually measured tones. You did your job better than he did his. That's what matters. Mara wanted to argue, wanted to explain that it wasn't that simple, that men like Jenkins would resent her success rather than respect it. But exhaustion was pulling her down, and the laudanum was beginning to blur the edges of pain into something more manageable. Thank you, she managed. Rest, Miss Cole. We'll talk more when you're feeling better. She heard him leave, his footsteps quiet on the floorboards, and then there was only darkness, and the slow rhythm of her breathing and the distant awareness of pain held at bay by medicine and exhaustion. When Mara woke, it was full dark outside and someone had lit a lamp on the bedside table. The room was small but comfortable, with whitewashed walls and simple furniture that looked well made and cared for. A window showed darkness and stars beyond the glass. Her ribs still hurt, but the sharp edge of agony had dulled to a persistent ache. She shifted carefully, testing her range of movement, and found she could breathe without gasping as long as she kept the breath shallow. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Come in," Mara called, her voice rough from sleep and thirst. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and warm brown eyes that suggested both competence and kindness. She carried a tray with a bowl of soup, bread, and a cup of water. "Miss Cole, I'm Mrs. Granger. Mr. Hale asked me to look in on you." She set the tray on the bedside table and helped Mara sit up against the pillows, her movements gentle but efficient. "You need to eat something before you sleep again. Doctor's orders." The soup was rich and savory, and Mara realized she was ravenously hungry, despite, or perhaps because of, the day's trauma. She ate slowly, letting Mrs. Granger fuss over her with the practiced care of someone who'd tended many injuries before. "You gave everyone quite a scare today," Mrs. Granger said as she collected the empty bowl. "Cooper came in looking like he'd seen a ghost. Said you nearly went over the cliff saving some fool steer." "It wasn't foolish," Mara said automatically. "It was worth money." Mrs. Granger's expression suggested she had opinions about the relative value of cattle versus human life, but she kept them to herself. "Well, you're safe now, and that's what matters. Is there anything else you need before I let you rest?" Mara hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her since she'd woken. "Why is Mr. Hale doing this? The medical leave, the room, the full pay? I've only been here 2 days." Mrs. Granger settled into the chair beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "Mr. Hale is a fair man, Miss Cole. When his father died and left him this ranch, Nathan could have sold it and lived easy on the proceeds. Instead, he stayed because he believed in what his father built, a place where people were valued for their work and their character, not their circumstances." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "I came to North Ridge 15 years ago, right after my husband died. I had no family, no prospects, no skills except cooking and keeping house. Mr. Hale's father hired me when no one else would, gave me a place to live and work, treated me with dignity. When he passed and Nathan took over, he kept every promise his father made. That's the kind of man he is." "That's rare," Mara said quietly. "Rarer than it should be." Mrs. Granger stood, smoothing her apron. "You rest now, morning soon enough to worry about the world." After she left, Mara lay in the darkness and thought about Nathan Hale, about a man who paid injured workers, who hired based on skill rather than prejudice, who apparently lived by principles that most people only pretended to value. She thought about Cooper's respect and Danny's easy acceptance, and the way even Tom Wardell's skepticism seemed to be thawing into something like grudging approval. She thought about the fact that in 2 days at Northridge Ranch, she'd been valued more highly than in 3 years of drifting from job to job. It should have made her happy. Instead, it made her afraid. Because the higher you climbed, the farther you had to fall. And Mara had fallen far enough already to know that hope was the most dangerous thing a person could carry. But as she drifted back towards sleep, her ribs aching and her body exhausted, she couldn't quite suppress the small, stubborn voice that whispered, maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time she'd found a place worth staying. The days blurred together in a haze of healing and enforced stillness that left Mara restless and anxious. Mrs. Granger brought meals 3 times daily, along with updates from the ranch that only emphasized how much work was happening without her. The gather had finished successfully. The cattle were being sorted and branded. Life at North Ridge went on as if she'd never been part of it. On the 4th morning, Mara woke to find Nathan Hale sitting in the chair beside her bed, a ledger open on his lap and a pencil behind his ear. He looked up when she stirred, his expression calm. "Good morning, Miss Cole. How are the ribs?" She pushed herself carefully to sitting, testing the pain. It was there, constant and nagging, but no longer the sharp agony of those first days. "Better. I should be able to return to work soon. Doc Morrison says another week at minimum." Hale closed the ledger and set it aside. "But since you're clearly going mad with boredom, I thought you might help me with something." Mara eyed him warily. "What kind of help?" "The kind that involves numbers and record-keeping rather than physical labor." He gestured to the ledger. "I'm trying to finalize the cattle count and reconcile it with our projections from spring. My bookkeeper quit last month, and I'm discovering I'm better with livestock than ledgers." It was such an unexpected request that Mara didn't know how to respond. She'd kept her father's ranch books for years before the bank took everything, had a natural facility with numbers that had made the work almost enjoyable. But admitting that felt like revealing too much, like giving Hale another reason to see her as something other than a simple ranch hand. "I'm not a bookkeeper," she said carefully. "Neither am I, but the work still needs doing." Hale's tone was pragmatic rather than persuasive. "If you'd rather not, that's fine. I thought you might appreciate something to occupy your time besides staring at the ceiling." He was right about that. The enforced idleness was driving her to distraction, making her feel useless and parasitic despite Hale's assurances that she was on legitimate medical leave. At least working with numbers would be productive, would justify the room and board and wages she was receiving. "Show me what you've got," she said finally. Hale's smile was brief but genuine. He pulled his chair closer to the bed and opened the ledger, revealing columns of numbers in a cramped, barely legible hand. "This is the spring count, what we estimated we had going into summer pasture. And this is the gather count from last week. They don't match, and I can't figure out why." Mara studied the figures, her mind automatically sorting through the discrepancies. Within minutes, she'd found the first error, a transposition that had turned 300 head into 3,000 in one column. Then another mistake, a simple addition error that had thrown off an entire section. "Here," she said, pointing, "and here. Your numbers are off because the baseline count was wrong." Hale leaned in to see where she was indicating, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding. "How did I miss that?" "Easy to do when you're working with your own figures. Fresh eyes catch things." Mara turned to the next page, already spotting more inconsistencies. "Do you have the actual tally sheets from the gather? I'll need to cross-reference them." "I'll have Mrs. Granger bring them." Hale stood, and Mara caught something in his expression. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction. "Thank you, Miss Cole. This is a real help." After he left, Mara sat with the ledger in her lap, her fingers tracing the columns of numbers. It had been 3 years since she'd done this kind of work, 3 years since she'd been anything more than hired muscle. The familiar patterns and logic of bookkeeping felt like coming home to a place she'd thought lost forever. Mrs. Granger arrived with a stack of tally sheets and a cup of coffee, her eyes twinkling with what looked like approval. "Mr. Hale says you're helping with the accounts. That's good. He's been tearing his hair out over those books for weeks." "He should hire a proper bookkeeper," Mara said, already sorting through the tally sheets. "He's been trying. Hard to find someone qualified who wants to live this far from town." Mrs. Granger paused in the doorway. Of course, if someone already on the ranch had the skills, that would solve the problem nicely. She left before Mara could respond, but the implication hung in the air. Mara tried to ignore it and focus on the work, but her mind kept circling back to the possibility. A bookkeeper would have steady work, year-round employment, protection from weather and physical injury. It would be safer, more stable, more respectable than cowhand work. It would also mean giving up the thing she loved most, being on horseback, working cattle, living the life her father had taught her. Mara shook her head and returned her attention to the numbers. One problem at a time. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, losing herself in the satisfaction of making chaotic figures align into coherent truth. By the time Mrs. Granger brought lunch, Mara had reconciled the entire gather count and identified several areas where Northridge was losing money through inefficiency or poor record keeping. Nathan Hale returned as the sun slanted toward evening, bringing with him the smell of horse and leather and honest work. He looked tired, but satisfied, the kind of exhaustion that came from a productive day. "How's it going?" he asked, settling into the chair. Mara turned the ledger toward him, showing the corrected columns. "Your count was off by about 200 head. Most of it was accounting errors, but there's also some actual loss, probably to rustlers or predators over the summer. I've marked the discrepancies." Hale studied her work, his expression growing more intent as he processed what she'd found. "This is excellent. Clear, organized, accurate." He looked up at her, and there was new respect in his eyes. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father taught me. He said ranching was 90% paperwork and 10% cowboying, and you had to be good at both to survive." He was right. Hale closed the ledger carefully. "Miss Cole, I have a proposition for you." Mara's stomach tightened. "What kind of proposition?" "The bookkeeper position is still open. The pay is the same as what I'm giving you now, double standard wage, but the work is year-round and indoors. You'd have your own office, regular hours, and considerably less risk of broken ribs." He paused, watching her carefully. "You're clearly qualified, and I need someone I can trust with the ranch's finances." It was everything Mara should want. Security, stability, respect. A position that used her mind rather than risking her body. No more sleeping in bunkhouses or enduring crude comments from men like Jenkins. No more wondering if she'd have work next month or next season. But the thought of giving up cowhand work felt like giving up a piece of herself, the last connection to her father and the life they'd built together. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to stop working cattle. That's what I came here to do." "What if you could do both?" Mara blinked. "What?" Hale leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "The bookkeeping doesn't require full days, especially once the systems are properly organized. What if you handled the accounts and still worked as a hand when we need extra riders? Best of both positions." It was so unexpected, so perfectly suited to what Mara actually wanted, that she immediately distrusted it. Why would you do that? It's inefficient to have someone split between two jobs. It's practical to use people's full range of skills. You're good with numbers and good with cattle. Northridge benefits from both. Hale's tone was matter-of-fact. Plus, it gives you options. If you decide you prefer one over the other, we can adjust. But this way, you're not forced to choose. Mara studied his face, looking for the angle, the hidden cost. But Nathan Hale's gray eyes were steady and honest, showing nothing except genuine interest in solving a problem that benefited everyone involved. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Fair enough? No rush? You've got another week of recovery anyway." He stood, collecting the ledger. "In the meantime, if you're willing, I'd appreciate your help getting the rest of the accounts in order. Turns out I'm even worse at this than I thought." After he left, Mara lay back against the pillows, her mind spinning. Every instinct she'd developed over 3 hard years screamed that this was too good to be true, that there had to be a catch, that trusting Nathan Hale's apparent integrity would end in disappointment and betrayal. But another part of her, smaller, more fragile but stubbornly persistent, whispered that maybe not all men were like the ones who'd taken advantage of her vulnerability. Maybe some people actually meant what they said and followed through on their promises. Maybe Nathan Hale was one of them. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mara was working through another set of account books when she heard boots on the floor outside her room, followed by a hesitant knock. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Granger. Instead, Tom Wardell appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his weathered face uncomfortable. He stood there for a moment, clearly wrestling with something, before he spoke. "Miss Cole, got a minute?" "Of course." Mara set aside the ledger, suddenly aware that she was wearing a borrowed nightgown and sitting in bed in the ranch owner's house. But Wardell's discomfort seemed to have nothing to do with impropriety. He stepped inside but didn't sit, standing instead like a man facing an unpleasant duty. Wanted to say something about what happened during the gather, about the steer. Mara braced herself for criticism, for the argument that she'd been reckless and stupid and proven that women didn't belong doing ranch work. That was some of the finest riding and roping I've seen in 30 years, Wardell said instead, his voice gruff. Stupid as hell, but fine work. You've got more guts than sense, and that's saying something. The unexpected praise left Mara speechless. Wardell shifted his weight, still looking uncomfortable. I'll be straight with you. When Mr. Haley said he was hiring a woman for full-time work, I thought it was a mistake. Thought you'd be more trouble than you were worth, that the men would complain, that it would disrupt everything. He met her eyes. I was wrong. Tom, let me finish, and he held up a hand. You've proven yourself twice over. The men see it, even Jenkins, though he'd choke before admitting it. You work harder than most of them. You're skilled as any hand we've got, and you don't complain or ask for special treatment. He paused. That's worth respect, regardless of what's between your legs. Mara felt something loosen in her chest, some tension she'd been carrying since the moment she'd arrived at North Ridge. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me. You earned it. Wardell turned his hat in his hands. Mr. Hale's talking about offering you the bookkeeper position. That true? He mentioned it. I haven't decided. Well, whatever you decide, you've got a place here, as a hand or otherwise. He nodded once, sharp and final. That's all I wanted to say. Heal up quick. We've got fall work coming, and we need good riders. He left before Mara could respond, his boots loud on the floorboards. She sat staring at the empty doorway, feeling something dangerously close to belonging. The week passed in a strange rhythm of healing and work. Mara's ribs knitted slowly, the sharp pain fading to a dull ache that only flared when she moved wrong. She spent her days organizing North Ridge's chaotic accounts, creating systems that would make the bookkeeping manageable for whoever took the position permanently. Mrs. Granger brought meals and gossip from the ranch, painting a picture of life continuing in its seasonal patterns while Mara recovered in isolation. Danny visited one evening, bringing fresh air and easy conversation. He sprawled in the chair beside her bed with the casual comfort of youth, telling stories about the gather and the other hands with an enthusiasm that made Mara smile despite herself. Jenkins is still mad about the steer thing, he reported cheerfully. Keeps saying you showed off, that it was reckless. But Cooper told him to shut up or he'd demonstrate some reckless behavior of his own, and that was the end of that. Cooper's been kind, Mara said carefully. Cooper's a good man. Lost his brother to the bank a few years back, so he's got no patience for bullies or cheats. Danny's expression turned more serious. He says you knew Samuel Garrett, that Garrett took your family's ranch. Word traveled fast in a small community. Mara nodded, not trusting her voice. I'm sorry, Danny said simply. That's rough. Garrett's a bastard. Sorry, ma'am, and everyone knows it. Wish someone would do something about him. Like what? Mara's tone was sharper than she'd intended. He's got the law on his side, lawyers to write whatever papers he needs, judges who owe him favors. What can anyone do against that? Danny shrugged, but his young face was troubled. Don't know, but it doesn't seem right that men like him can just destroy people's lives and face no consequences. Right doesn't matter much when wrong has all the power. The bitterness in her own voice surprised Mara. She'd thought she'd moved past the anger, had learned to accept what had happened as simply one more hard truth about how the world worked, but apparently the wound was still raw beneath the scar tissue. Danny left eventually, and Mara returned to the account books with renewed focus, trying to lose herself in numbers that made sense and added up to truth. But her mind kept drifting to Samuel Garrett, to the bank in Ridgeway, to the injustice of powerful men crushing those too poor or powerless to fight back. She was still brooding when Nathan Hale appeared the next morning, his expression grim in a way she hadn't seen before. What's wrong? She asked immediately. Hale sat down heavily, his usual composure fractured. I got a letter from Ridgeway Bank yesterday. Samuel Garrett is calling in my loan. The words hit Mara like a physical blow. What? Why? He doesn't need a reason. The loan agreement gives him the right to demand full repayment at any time with 90 days' notice. Hale's jaw was tight with controlled fury. It's a standard clause I didn't think twice about when I signed 5 years ago. I've never missed a payment, never been late, but apparently that doesn't matter. Mara's mind raced, her bookkeeper's instincts immediately calculating. How much do you owe? $20,000. The number was staggering. $20,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, more than a small ranch could generate in years. Even a successful operation like North Ridge would struggle to raise that much cash in 3 months. What are your assets? Mara heard herself ask, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. Hale looked at her in surprise, then seemed to recognize that she was thinking practically rather than emotionally. The land, the cattle, the buildings. All told, probably worth $50,000 if I could get fair market value. But Garrett knows I can't sell fast enough to raise $20,000 in cash before the deadline. That's the whole point. He wants the ranch. The pattern was sickeningly familiar. He'll force foreclosure, buy the property at auction for a fraction of its value, then resell it for profit, just like he did to my father, to Cooper's brother, to who knows how many others. I won't let that happen. But even as Hale said it, his expression showed he didn't know how to prevent it. Mara's fingers itched for pencil and paper, for the tools to work this problem the way she'd work any accounting challenge. Let me see the loan documents, and all your financial records, income, expenses, assets, everything. Miss Cole, Mara, and I'm serious. 2 heads are better than 1, and I might see something you've missed. She met his eyes. Unless you've got a better plan? Hale studied her for a long moment, and Mara could see him weighing trust against pride, desperation against independence. Finally, he nodded. All right. I'll have everything brought to you this afternoon. He was true to his word. By evening, Mara's room had been transformed into a makeshift office, every available surface covered with ledgers, contracts, tally sheets, and financial documents. Mrs. Granger had brought a desk and better lamps, clucking about eye strain and proper working conditions. Mara barely noticed. She was lost in the numbers, her mind working through scenarios and calculations with the focused intensity of someone solving a puzzle that mattered more than anything. The loan agreement was damning in its simplicity. Garrett had structured it to look generous, reasonable interest rates, flexible payment terms, while including that one devastating clause about callable repayment. It was legal, technically fair, and completely predatory. A trap disguised as opportunity. Northridge's finances were solid, but not liquid. Most of the ranch's value was tied up in land and livestock, assets that would take months to convert to cash at fair prices. Hale could sell quickly, but only at a loss that would leave him short of the required $20,000. Mara worked through the night, her ribs protesting the long hours hunched over papers, but her mind too engaged to stop. By dawn, she had a rough plan, desperate, risky, but possible. Nathan Hale found her still working when he arrived after breakfast, her eyes gritty with exhaustion, but her expression determined. I think I've found a way, she said without preamble. It's not perfect, but it might work. Hale pulled up a chair, his full attention on her. I'm listening. You can't raise $20,000 in cash by selling assets quickly. You'd take too much of a loss. But you could raise it by restructuring the ranch's operations and bringing in partners. She spread out the calculations she'd made. Sell the southern pasture land. It's good property, but not essential to operations. That should bring about $8,000 if you find the right buyer. Then bring in neighboring ranchers as limited partners in the cattle operation. They invest cash now, take a share of profits for the next 3 years. That could raise another $10,000. That's only $18,000, Hale pointed out. The last $2,000 comes from cutting expenses to the bone and selling everything non-essential. Spare equipment, extra horses, anything you can live without for a season. Mara met his eyes. It means operating lean for a year, maybe 2. No hired hands except essentials, no new equipment, no margin for error. But it would get you the cash to pay off Garrett and own the ranch free and clear. Hale studied the figures, his expression unreadable. This would work? It should. If the land sells for market value, if you can find partners willing to invest, if nothing goes catastrophically wrong. Mara heard the uncertainty in her own voice. There are a lot of ifs. But it's possible. Yes. Hale was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. You've put a lot of work into this. Why? The question was fair. Mara had spent the entire night working on a problem that wasn't hers to solve, investing emotional energy and intellectual effort into saving a ranch she'd worked at for less than 2 weeks. She should have kept her distance, protected herself from becoming invested in an outcome she couldn't control. But the truth was, she'd stopped being distant the moment Nathan Hale had offered her double wage and treated her like her skills mattered. She'd become invested when Tom Wardell had acknowledged her worth and Cooper had shared his grief. She'd started caring when this place had felt, for the first time in 3 years, like somewhere she might actually belong. Because Garrett took everything from my father, she said quietly, and I'll be damned if I watch him do it to someone else without fighting back. Something shifted in Hale's expression. Understanding, maybe, or shared purpose. Then let's fight back. Show me how to make this work. They spent the next 3 days planning every detail. Mara's ribs still ached, but the pain was background noise compared to the urgency of the work. She drafted sales proposals for the southern pasture, wrote partnership agreements for the neighboring ranchers, created detailed budgets that showed exactly where every dollar would come from and go. Nathan Hale proved to be a quick student and an active partner in the planning. He knew his neighbors, knew who might be interested in investing, and who had cash available. He had ideas about which assets were truly necessary and which could be sold without crippling operations. Together, they refined Mara's initial plan into something that felt achievable rather than merely desperate. Tom Wardell was brought into the planning on the 4th day, his weathered face grim as he learned about Garrett's move. But when Hale explained the plan, Mara's plan, the foreman's expression shifted to something like respect. It could work, he said slowly. It'll be tight, and we'll all be working double duty with a smaller crew, but it could work. He looked at Mara. You came up with this? Miss Cole did most of the heavy lifting, Hale confirmed. I'm just trying to keep up. Wardell nodded slowly. Then I guess it's a good thing you hired her, sir. Real good thing. The comment was small, almost casual, but it represented a shift that Mara recognized. She wasn't just being tolerated anymore. She was being valued, respected, seen as essential rather than expendable. It should have made her happy. Instead, it terrified her, because now she had something to lose. Now she was invested in Northridge's survival, not just as an employee, but as someone who cared about the place and the people in it. And caring meant vulnerability, meant the possibility of heartbreak when things inevitably fell apart. But it was too late to protect herself now. She was already in too deep, already committed to fighting for a ranch that wasn't hers and people she barely knew but somehow cared about anyway. So Mara pushed the fear aside and focused on the work, because work was something she understood and could control. The rest, hope, belonging, the dangerous possibility of home, would have to sort itself out later. For now, they had a plan. And if it worked, they'd save Northridge from Samuel Garrett's predatory grasp. And if it failed, well. Mara had survived loss before. She'd survive it again. But this time, she wouldn't go down without a fight. The first test of their plan came 2 days later when Nathan Hale rode out to meet with William Brennan, whose ranch bordered Northridge to the east. Mara had wanted to go with him, but Doc Morrison had finally cleared her to walk around the house and nothing more. So she waited in her makeshift office, pacing despite the protest from her healing ribs, until she heard hoofbeats in the yard just after sunset. Hale appeared in her doorway, looking exhausted, but grimly satisfied. He's in. $5,000 for a 20% stake in cattle profits over 3 years. Mara felt tension she hadn't realized she was carrying release from her shoulders. That's more than we projected. Brennan hates Garrett as much as anyone. Lost some grazing rights to him 4 years back in a dispute that somehow always got decided in the bank's favor. Hale dropped into the chair across from her desk. He said if investing in Northridge means standing up to Garrett's monopoly, he's happy to pay premium for the privilege. How many more do we need? At least 2, maybe 3, depending on how much they can put in. Hale rubbed his face, and Mara could see the strain of the past week wearing on him. I'm meeting with the Johnsons tomorrow, then the Chen family the day after. The Chens? Mara looked up sharply, thinking of Mrs. Chen at the boarding house. Different family. They run sheep on the Western Hills. Good people, though some of the cattlemen won't work with them because of old prejudices about sheep versus cattle. Hale's tone made clear what he thought of those prejudices. But their money spends the same as anyone's, and I'm in no position to be particular. The meetings continued over the next week, and slowly the impossible began to look merely difficult. The Johnsons contributed $3,000. The Chens added another $2,000, along with a proposal to coordinate grazing schedules that would benefit both operations. A widow named Sarah Prescott, who owned a small but prosperous spread to the south, surprised everyone by offering $1,500 and asking to be kept informed of any future investment opportunities. That's $11,500, Mara calculated, updating her figures. Plus Brennan's $5,000 makes $16,500. We're getting close. The southern pasture sale should cover the rest, Hale said. I've got 3 potential buyers coming to look at it next week. But the land sale proved more complicated than anticipated. The first buyer offered $6,000, nearly $3,000 below the property's value. The second wanted to pay in installments over 2 years, which defeated the purpose entirely. The third never showed up, sending word through a messenger that he'd decided to look at property elsewhere. Mara watched Nathan's frustration mount as the 90-day deadline crept closer, and the gap in their funding remained stubbornly wide. They were 60 days in with 30 to go, and they were still short $3,500 with no clear path to raising it. We could take the $6,000 offer, Hale said one evening, staring at the numbers Mara had written and rewritten a dozen times. Sell some of the breeding stock to make up the difference. You sell those heifers and you'll cripple your herd growth for years, Mara countered. That's not solving the problem. That's just trading one crisis for another. Then what do you suggest? His voice was sharp with stress and exhaustion. We're running out of time and options. Mara had been thinking about this for days, turning over an idea that seemed simultaneously obvious and impossible. What if we go directly after Garrett? Hale looked at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. What? Think about it. Garrett's been doing this for 20 years, calling loans early, forcing foreclosures, buying property cheap and reselling high. There has to be a pattern, records, something that proves it's not just legitimate business, but systematic predation. Mara leaned forward, warming to her argument. If we could expose that pattern, show that he's deliberately ruining people, we might be able to pressure him to extend your loan or renegotiate terms. You want to investigate Samuel Garrett? Hale's tone was incredulous. A man with enough power to own judges and lawyers? That's not a plan, Mara. That's suicide. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it was almost shocking. But Mara pressed on, refusing to be deterred by fear or common sense. It's not suicide if we're careful, and it's not like we have better options. She met his eyes, letting him see her determination. I'm going to Ridgeway tomorrow to talk to people Garrett has destroyed, Cooper's brother's widow, others who lost property. If there's a pattern, I'll find it. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous, and you're still recovering from broken ribs. Doc Morrison cleared me for light activity yesterday. Riding a wagon to town qualifies. Mara kept her voice level, reasonable. And I'm doing this with or without your permission. I'd prefer with, because your name might open doors mine won't. But either way, I'm going. They stared at each other across the desk, and Mara could see Hale weighing authority against pragmatism, protection against necessity. Finally, he sighed. If you're going to do this fool thing, you're taking Danny with you. And you're being careful. No confronting Garrett directly. No taking risks that aren't absolutely necessary. Agreed. Mara felt a flutter of triumph mixed with apprehension. She was committed now, no backing out. And Mara? Hale's voice stopped her as she stood to leave. Thank you for caring enough to fight. The words settled somewhere deep in her chest, warm and terrifying in equal measure. We're not beaten yet. She left before he could see how much those simple words of gratitude affected her, before he could recognize that she was fighting as much for herself as for him, for a place that had given her something she'd thought lost forever. The ride to Ridgeway took most of the morning, Danny driving the wagon while Mara sat beside him trying not to wince every time they hit a rut. Her ribs were healing well, but the jarring motion still sent occasional spikes of pain through her torso. She ignored them, too focused on the task ahead to worry about minor discomfort. You really think we can find something on Garrett? Danny asked as the town came into view. I think powerful men get careless when they're used to winning, and careless men leave trails. Mara adjusted her hat against the midday sun. We just need to find those trails and follow them. Their first stop was a small farmhouse on the edge of town, where Cooper's brother's widow lived with her 2 children. Mary Brennan was a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much sorrow. She looked surprised when Mara introduced herself, then wary. "Tom sent word you might come by," she said, not inviting them inside. "Said you want to talk about Samuel and the bank." "If you're willing," Mara said gently. "I know it's painful to revisit, but we're trying to stop Garrett from doing to others what he did to your husband." Something flickered in Mary's expression. Interest, maybe, or the faint ember of old anger. "Come in then. I'll make coffee." The house was sparse but clean, decorated with the careful pride of someone making do with very little. Mary's children, a girl of about 8 and a boy younger, watched from the doorway with wide, curious eyes until their mother shooed them outside to play. "James took the loan 5 years ago," Mary began, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like it was anchoring her to the present. "We needed money to expand the herd, buy better breeding stock. Garrett offered good terms, seemed fair. We thought we were lucky." "When did things change?" Mara asked. 3 years in. We'd never missed a payment. We're actually ahead of schedule. Then Garrett called the loan due in full, said it was bank policy, gave us 90 days. Mary's voice was flat with old pain. "We couldn't raise the money. Tried selling everything, but Garrett had already spread word that we were in trouble. No one would pay fair value. We lost the farm, lost everything we'd built." "Did your husband keep records? Loan documents? Payment receipts?" "He kept everything. Was meticulous about it, thought if we stayed on top of the paperwork we'd be safe." Mary set down her cup and disappeared into a back room, returning with a battered wooden box. "I couldn't bear to throw it away. Seemed like it would be admitting James died for nothing." Mara opened the box with careful reverence, aware she was handling the remnants of a destroyed life. Inside were neatly organized folders containing loan agreements, payment schedules, correspondence with the bank. James Brennan had indeed been meticulous, and his careful record-keeping might just be the weapon they needed. "May I borrow these?" Mara asked. "I'll return them, I promise. But I need to compare your husband's loan terms with others, see if there's a pattern." Mary studied her for a long moment. "You think you can hurt Garrett? Really hurt him?" "I think we can try. I can't promise more than that." "That's more than anyone else has offered." Mary pushed the box toward Mara. "Take them. And if you do manage to make Garrett pay for what he's done, you tell him it's for James, and for all the others." They visited 4 more families that afternoon, each with similar stories of reasonable loans turned predatory, of dreams destroyed by a man who treated human lives like accounting entries. Each family had kept their paperwork, clinging to evidence of injustice, even when justice seemed impossible. By the time they returned to the wagon, Mara had 3 more boxes of documents and a burning rage that made her ribs feel like a minor inconvenience. "This is evil," Danny said quietly as they headed back toward North Ridge. "Plain and simple evil." "Yes," Mara's voice was hard, "and we're going to expose it." She spent the next week buried in documents, cross-referencing loan terms and payment schedules, building a timeline of Garrett's predatory lending practices. A pattern emerged with damning clarity. Every loan Garrett issued to small ranchers and farmers contained the same early call clause. Every loan was called within 3 to 4 years, always when the borrower was current on payments, but before they could build enough equity to easily refinance. Every foreclosed property was purchased at auction by shell companies that traced back to Garrett himself, then resold at substantial profit. It was systematic, calculated, and entirely legal. Immoral as hell, but legal. "We need more than a pattern," Nathan said when Mara showed him her findings. "We need proof of fraud or coercion, something that makes this criminal rather than just unconscionable business practice." Mara had been thinking the same thing. The documents showed what Garrett was doing, but they didn't show intent to defraud or any violation of banking law. Without that, they had a moral case, but no legal one. "There has to be something we're missing," she muttered, paging through James Brennan's loan documents for the 5th time. "Some connection we're not seeing." The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Granger appeared in Mara's office late one evening with tea and sandwiches, clucking about how no one could think properly on an empty stomach. As she set down the tray, her eye fell on one of the loan documents spread across the desk. "That's Judge Callahan's signature," she said, pointing to a witness signature at the bottom of the page. Mara looked up sharply. "You know Judge Callahan." "Everyone knows Judge Callahan. He handles most of the legal matters in Ridgeway, including foreclosure proceedings." Mrs. Granger peered more closely at the document. "Though I'm surprised to see him witnessing private loan agreements. That's not usually part of a judge's duties." Something clicked in Mara's mind. She pulled out the other loan documents, checking the witness signatures. Judge Callahan's name appeared on every single one, always as a witness, always with the same flourishing signature. "Why would a judge witness these documents?" she asked, more to herself than to Mrs. Granger. "He wouldn't, unless he had some interest in ensuring they were legally binding." The housekeeper's expression had sharpened with interest. "Or unless someone was paying him to make sure they couldn't be challenged later." Mara felt excitement building. "If we could prove Callahan has a financial relationship with Garrett beyond normal legal fees, that he's been paid to facilitate these predatory loans, then you'd have corruption and fraud, not just sharp business practice." Mrs. Granger nodded approvingly. "Smart girl, but proving that kind of connection won't be easy." "No," Mara agreed, "but it's possible, and possible is all we need." The next day, she sent Danny into Ridgeway with a list of questions and the names of people who might have answers. Who handled Garrett's legal work? Did Callahan have business dealings with the bank beyond his role as judge? Were there any rumors of improper relationships between the two men? Danny returned that evening with more than rumors. He brought testimony from a former bank clerk who'd been fired 2 years ago for questioning some of Garrett's practices. The man, a nervous fellow named Peter Walsh, had agreed to meet with Mara after Danny assured him his identity would be protected. Walsh arrived at North Ridge after dark, his eyes darting nervously as Mrs. Granger showed him into Mara's office. He refused to sit, instead pacing the small space like a caged animal. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "If Garrett finds out I talked to you—" "He won't," Mara assured him. "We're being careful. Please, Mr. Walsh, tell me what you know about Judge Callahan and Samuel Garrett." Walsh took a shaky breath. "Callahan owns shares in the bank. Not many, maybe 5%, but enough to profit when the bank profits. And the bank profits most from foreclosures. Buying property cheap, reselling high, taking commission on both ends. Can you prove this? Are there records? The bank's annual reports list major shareholders. Callahan's name is there, buried in the legal disclosures that no one ever reads." Walsh finally sat, his hands trembling. "I found it when I was doing routine filing 2 years ago. Started noticing how Callahan always ruled in Garrett's favor in foreclosure cases, how he always witnessed the loan documents that gave Garrett the most power. When I asked about it, I was told to mind my own business. When I kept asking, I was fired." Mara felt pieces clicking into place. A judge who profits from foreclosures ruling on foreclosure cases. That's conflict of interest at minimum, possibly corruption. "It's worse than that," Walsh said quietly. "I kept copies of some documents before I was fired. Correspondence between Garrett and Callahan, discussing specific properties they wanted to acquire, planning which loans to call when. They were coordinating the whole thing." "You have these documents?" Walsh reached into his coat and pulled out a worn envelope. "I've been carrying them for 2 years, waiting for someone to care enough to do something about it." "I guess you're that someone." Mara took the envelope with hands that wanted to shake. Inside were letters, bank memos, legal documents that painted a clear picture of conspiracy between a banker and a judge to systematically defraud property owners. It was everything they needed and more. "Mr. Walsh, you may have just saved Northridge Ranch," she said. "Then maybe James Brennan's death will mean something after all." Walsh stood to leave. "But be careful, Miss Cole. Garrett's not a man who takes losing well, and he's got more power than you might think." After Walsh left, Mara sat alone with the documents, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. They had proof of corruption now, evidence that could destroy Garrett's reputation and possibly send him to prison. But using that evidence would mean going up against a man who controlled judges, lawyers, and substantial financial resources. It would be dangerous. It could fail. And even if it succeeded, Garrett might find ways to retaliate that they hadn't anticipated. But the alternative was watching Nathan lose North Ridge the same way her father had lost their ranch, the same way James Brennan and countless others had lost everything they'd built. Mara had stood by and watched once before, too young and ignorant to fight back. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Nathan Hale's reaction to the documents was carefully controlled fury. He read through Walsh's evidence twice, his jaw tightening with each page, before setting them down with deliberate care. "This is explosive," he said finally. "If we take this to the territorial attorney, it could bring down both Garrett and Callahan. It could also backfire spectacularly if Garrett has connections we don't know about," Mara countered. "We need to be strategic about how we use this." They sat in Hale's study late into the night, planning their approach with the careful precision of generals preparing for battle. Tom Wardell joined them, his experience and pragmatism adding weight to their strategy. Even Mrs. Granger contributed, her knowledge of Ridgway's social dynamics proving unexpectedly valuable. "We don't go to the territorial attorney first," Mara argued. "We go to Garrett directly, show him what we have, and offer a deal." "You want to negotiate with him?" Hale looked skeptical. "I want to give him a choice between the lesser of two evils. He can extend your loan indefinitely at reduced interest, or we can take this evidence to every newspaper, attorney, and government official in Oregon Territory." Mara met Hale's eyes. "Garrett's smart. He'll choose self-preservation over revenge. And if he doesn't, then we burn his empire to the ground and accept the consequences." Her voice was harder than she'd intended. "But either way, you keep North Ridge." The meeting with Samuel Garrett was scheduled for the following week at his office in Ridgway. Mara insisted on being present despite Nathan's protests about propriety and danger. In the end, she won the argument the same way she'd won most of them, by making it clear she was going regardless of permission. The day arrived cold and gray, with clouds promising rain before evening. Mara dressed carefully in her best clothes, a simple dress that Mrs. Granger had altered to fit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older and more businesslike. She wanted Garrett to take her seriously, to see her as a threat rather than a curiosity. Nathan wore his Sunday suit, and together they made an odd but determined pair as they entered the Ridgway Bank building. The interior was all dark wood and brass fixtures, designed to intimidate with displays of wealth and permanence. A clerk directed them to the second floor, where Samuel Garrett's private office overlooked the main street. Garrett himself was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of unchallenged power. He stood as they entered, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Mr. Hale and Miss—" He paused, clearly not recognizing Mara. "Cole?" she supplied. "Mara Cole. My father was Thomas Cole." Something flickered in Garrett's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "Ah, yes, I recall the name. A unfortunate situation, as I remember." "Unfortunate," Mara repeated, her voice flat. "That's one word for it." Garrett's smile thinned. "Please, sit. I assume this is about your loan, Mr. Hale. I'm afraid the terms are quite clear. Payment in full is due in 3 weeks, and I'm not in the habit of renegotiating settled agreements." "We're not here to beg," Nathan said, his voice level. "We're here to offer you a choice." He nodded to Mara, who placed the envelope of documents on Garrett's desk. The banker opened it with casual interest that quickly transformed into something harder as he read through Walsh's evidence. The silence stretched as Garrett finished reading and carefully returned the documents to their envelope. When he finally looked up, his expression was controlled, but his eyes held calculation. "This is very interesting," he said mildly. "Though I'm not sure what you think it proves. Business correspondence between a banker and a judge is hardly unusual. Correspondence detailing plans to manipulate foreclosures for personal profit is very unusual," Mara countered. "As is a judge who rules on cases where he has direct financial interest. The territorial attorney would find it fascinating reading." "Would they?" Garrett leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, Miss Cole, do you know who the territorial attorney is? His name is Marcus Webb. He banks with me, owes me several significant favors, and considers Judge Callahan a close personal friend." His smile was cold. "You're out of your depth, girl. Go home before you get hurt." "We're not going to the territorial attorney," Nathan said before Mara could respond. We're going to every newspaper in Oregon Territory. The Oregonian, the East Oregonian, the Portland Daily. We're going to make sure every rancher, farmer, and businessman knows exactly how Ridgeway Bank operates. For the first time, Garrett's composure cracked slightly. That would be slander. It would be truth backed by documentation. Mara leaned forward. Your empire is built on reputation and trust. What happens when people learn you've been systematically defrauding property owners for 20 years? When they learn their judge is in your pocket? How many depositors will you have left when this story breaks? Garrett's jaw tightened, and Mara saw the moment he recognized they were serious, that they had enough evidence to cause real damage even if he could prevent criminal prosecution. What do you want? He asked finally. Nathan's loan extended indefinitely at 3% interest, Mara said, and a moratorium on early call clauses for all existing agricultural loans. You can still make money, just not by destroying lives. And in exchange? We keep these documents private. Your reputation stays intact, your business continues. Nathan's voice was hard. But if you ever come after Northridge again, or if we hear about any more suspicious foreclosures, everything goes public. Those are the terms. Garrett studied them both, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of the ornate clock on his wall. Finally, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the town he'd controlled for so long. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. Fighting me, threatening me. I have resources you can't imagine, connections that go far beyond this territory. Maybe, Mara said, but we have the truth, and sometimes that's enough. Garrett turned to face them, and for a moment Mara saw something like respect in his cold eyes. I'll have the revised loan documents prepared by week's end, and I'll reconsider my lending policies going forward. His smile was bitter. Congratulations, Mr. Hale. It seems you've won. We've won, Nathan corrected, glancing at Mara, and we'll be watching to make sure you honor this agreement. They left Garrett's office with controlled dignity, not speaking until they were back in the wagon and heading out of town. Then Nathan let out a long, shaky breath. I can't believe that worked, he said. Neither can I, Mara admitted, feeling the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to release. But it did. Northridge is safe. Because of you. Nathan pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. You saved my ranch, Mara. Risked yourself, worked yourself half to death, faced down a man who destroyed your family. I can never repay that. You already did, Mara said quietly. You gave me a chance when no one else would. Treated me like I mattered, like my skills were worth something. That's payment enough. It's not nearly enough. Nathan's voice was rough with emotion. But I'll spend whatever time I have making sure you know how much you're valued here. Not just as an employee, but as someone who belongs. The word hit Mara square in the chest. Belonging. The thing she'd stopped believing possible. The dream she'd buried 3 years ago along with her father and her childhood home. I'd like that, she whispered. They rode back to Northridge in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun breaking through clouds to paint the valley in shades of gold. Ahead, Mara could see the ranch buildings, the grazing cattle, the land that had become, against all odds and expectations, something like home. The fight wasn't over. Garrett would honor the agreement because he had to, but he wouldn't forget or forgive. There would be consequences, ripples from this confrontation that they couldn't predict or control. But for now, Northridge was safe, and Mara Cole, the orphaned daughter of a destroyed rancher, had found something she'd thought lost forever. Not just employment or security, but purpose, community, a place where her skills and courage mattered, where she was valued for who she was rather than tolerated despite it. It wasn't the ending she'd expected when she'd roped that runaway steer all those weeks ago. It was better. The revised loan documents arrived at Northridge 3 days later, delivered by a stone-faced clerk who wouldn't meet Nathan's eyes. The terms were exactly as negotiated, indefinite extension at 3% interest, with a clause explicitly removing any early call provisions. It was a victory, complete and documented, but the taste of it was complicated by the knowledge of what it had cost and what it might still cost in ways they couldn't yet see. Mara was in the ranch office, now officially hers as Northridge's bookkeeper and occasional ranch hand, when Nathan brought her the papers. She read through them twice, checking every clause and condition with the thoroughness that had become her trademark. "It's legitimate," she said finally. He honored the agreement. For now. Nathan's expression was cautious. "But men like Garrett don't forget humiliation. We'll need to stay vigilant." "We will." Mara set the documents aside and pulled out the ledger she'd been working on. "In the meantime, we've got a ranch to run and partners to keep happy. The Brennans are expecting their first profit share next month, and the numbers are tight." They fell into the comfortable rhythm of work, discussing cattle prices and feed costs and the 100 small decisions that kept a ranch functioning. It was familiar now, this partnership, the way they complemented each other's strengths and compensated for weaknesses. Nathan understood the land and livestock with the instinct of someone raised to it. Mara understood the numbers and strategy with the precision of someone who'd learned that survival depended on seeing patterns others missed. Together, they made Northridge work. The weeks that followed were busy with the ordinary demands of ranch life. Cattle needed to be moved to winter pasture. Equipment needed repair before the first snow. The crew needed managing, wages needed calculating, and the careful budget Mara had created needed constant adjustment as reality proved more complicated than projections. But there was also something new, something Mara had never experienced in her 3 years of drifting. There was stability, routine, the deep satisfaction of building something rather than just surviving day to day. Her ribs healed completely, and Doc Morrison cleared her for full work. Mara celebrated by spending an entire day on horseback, helping Cooper and Danny move a herd to the high meadow, her body remembering every skill her father had taught her, her mare responding to the slightest touch like they were two parts of the same creature. That evening, exhausted and happy in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible, Mara returned to find Nathan waiting by the barn. "Good day?" he asked. "The best." She dismounted and began unsaddling her mare, her movements automatic. "Forgot how much I missed this. The bookkeeping is good work, important work, but there's nothing quite like being on a horse with cattle to move and land stretching out as far as you can see." "I'm glad you can do both." Nathan leaned against the barn door watching her work. "Not many people have that range of skills. Fewer still want to use all of them. Seemed wasteful to choose when I could have both." Mara hefted her saddle onto its rack and turned to face him. "Besides, you were desperate enough to let me dictate terms. I took advantage. Best advantage anyone ever took of me." His smile was warm, genuine. "I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to discuss it with you before I made it official." Mara felt a flutter of nervousness. Discussions that started that way could go in any direction, and she'd learned to be wary of unexpected proposals. "All right. The partnership model we used to raise money for the loan. It worked better than I expected. The other ranchers liked having a stake in Northridge's success, and it gave us capital without taking on debt." Nathan pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I want to expand it, formalize the arrangement into a cooperative that shares resources, coordinates grazing and water rights, negotiates better prices with buyers. Strength in numbers." It was ambitious and smart, the kind of long-term thinking that could transform how small ranchers operated. Mara's mind immediately began working through implications and logistics. "You'd need clear governance structure," she said. "Rules about decision-making, profit distribution, what happens when members disagree, and you'd need someone to manage it, keep the books, coordinate between ranches." "I'd need you to manage it," Nathan corrected. "This was your idea originally, your strategy that saved Northridge. You understand how it works better than anyone." The offer was staggering. Managing a cooperative of ranches would be a significant role, influential and respected. It was the kind of position that could establish Mara's reputation permanently, prove once and for all that she belonged in this world. It was also terrifying. "That's a lot of responsibility," she said carefully. "You've already proven you can handle it. The question is whether you want to." Nathan's gray eyes were steady, patient. "I'm not trying to push you into something you don't want, Mara. I'm offering because I trust your judgment and your integrity. But if you'd rather just focus on Northridge, that's fine too." Mara thought about the girl she'd been 3 years ago, orphaned and dispossessed, watching strangers auction off everything her father had built. She thought about the woman she'd become through sheer necessity, learning to survive by keeping her head down and her expectations low. And she thought about who she might become if she stopped letting fear make her decisions. "I want to do it," she said, "but I have one condition." "Name it." "We bring in Mary Brennan as assistant manager. She's got a sharp mind and she needs steady work. Plus, she understands what we're fighting for better than most." Mara met Nathan's eyes. "This cooperative isn't just about profit. It's about making sure what happened to her husband, to my father, to all those families, it doesn't happen again. She deserves to be part of that." Nathan's smile was proud. "Done. I'll have the papers drawn up next week." They shook hands on it, the gesture formal but freighted with significance. This was more than a business arrangement. It was a statement about what kind of community they wanted to build, what values they wanted to embody. It was choosing principle over expedience, long-term flourishing over short-term gain. It was, Mara realized, exactly what her father would have wanted. The cooperative formed over the following months with surprising speed. The ranchers who'd invested in saving Northridge were eager to formalize the arrangement, and others joined once they understood the benefits. By spring, they had 12-member ranches, a governing board, and a set of bylaws that Mara had drafted with meticulous attention to fairness and sustainability. Mary Brennan proved to be everything Mara had hoped: organized, intelligent, and possessed of a quiet determination that reminded Mara of herself. Working together, they created systems for coordinating grazing schedules, sharing equipment, and negotiating with buyers as a unified group. The cooperative's first cattle sale brought prices 15% higher than individual ranchers had been getting, and that success attracted more members. But the cooperative's real power became apparent when Samuel Garrett attempted to foreclose on the Chen family's ranch. The attempt was subtle, disguised as legitimate business. A minor technicality in their loan agreement, a supposed missed payment that the Chens insisted they'd made on time. Garrett claimed his record showed otherwise and demanded immediate repayment in full. It was exactly the kind of maneuver that had worked for him dozens of times before. The Chens would struggle to prove the payment, couldn't afford lawyers to fight the claim, and would lose their land to foreclosure within months. But this time was different. This time, the Chens were part of the cooperative, and the cooperative had Mara Cole. She descended on Ridgeway with the fury of someone who'd seen this play before and refused to let it happen again. Armed with the cooperative's resources and Mary Brennan's methodical research, Mara traced the Chen's payment through bank records, found the deposit receipt that Garrett claimed didn't exist, and presented it along with a formal complaint to the Territorial Banking Commission. The complaint included, almost as an afterthought, copies of the evidence they'd gathered months ago about Garrett's pattern of predatory lending, just in case the commission needed additional context about the banker's business practices. Garrett backed down within a week. The foreclosure attempt was quietly dropped, the supposed missed payment was found in the bank's records after all, and the Chens kept their ranch. Word spread fast. Within a month, 3 more ranchers joined the cooperative specifically because they wanted protection from the kind of financial predation that Garrett represented. The cooperative wasn't just an economic alliance anymore. It was becoming a political force, a way for small operators to stand up to concentrated power. And Mara found herself at the center of it, respected and even admired by people who 6 months ago wouldn't have trusted a woman to manage a simple ranch account. The recognition should have satisfied her, should have been enough. But late at night, alone in the small house that Nathan had built for her on North Ridge land, Mara sometimes felt the weight of expectations pressing down like a physical thing. She'd become important, influential, someone people looked to for leadership and solutions. It was gratifying and exhausting in equal measure. Nathan seemed to sense her struggle without her having to voice it. He appeared at her door one evening in early summer, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he had something specific to discuss. "You're working too hard," he said without preamble, handing her one of the cups. "Says the man who was up before dawn checking fence lines." Mara gestured for him to sit on the porch steps beside her. "I'm allowed to work too hard. It's my ranch." He settled next to her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You're allowed to take a day off occasionally. The cooperative won't collapse if you rest." "Won't it?" Mara's tone was sharper than she'd intended. "We've got the Johnson Ranch trying to negotiate better terms than everyone else. The Prescott widow wants to expand into sheep despite half the members objecting, and Garrett's probably planning his next move as we speak. If I'm not managing it all..." Someone else will. Mary's perfectly capable of handling day-to-day operations. Nathan turned to look at her, his expression serious. Mara, you saved North Ridge. You built the cooperative from nothing. You've done more in 6 months than most people do in a lifetime. You're allowed to stop proving yourself. The words hit harder than Mara expected, cutting through defenses she hadn't realized she'd built. What if I stop and everything falls apart? What if the only reason any of this works is because I'm constantly holding it together? Then it deserves to fall apart, and we'll build something better. Nathan's voice was gentle but firm. But I don't think that's what would happen. I think you've built systems and relationships strong enough to survive without constant intervention. And I think you're running yourself into the ground because you're afraid to find out if you're actually as essential as you feel you need to be. Mara wanted to argue, wanted to deny the uncomfortable accuracy of his observation. But sitting on her porch in the soft evening light, exhausted and honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be, she couldn't muster the energy for deflection. I don't know how to not work, she admitted quietly. For 3 years, constant work was the only thing keeping me alive. If I stopped moving, I'd have to think about what I'd lost, what I'd become. Now I've got something worth keeping, and I'm terrified that if I let my guard down for even a moment, it'll all disappear. It won't disappear. You've earned your place here, Mara, not through constant work or proving yourself over and over. You've earned it by being competent and principled and willing to fight for what matters. Nathan shifted slightly, and now their shoulders were touching, warm and solid. You don't have to keep earning what you've already won. The simple truth of it made Mara's throat tight with emotion. She'd been fighting so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be safe, to trust that good things could last. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. How to be happy. How to let myself believe this is real. One day at a time. Nathan's hand found hers, his calloused fingers gentle. Take a day off tomorrow, sleep late, read a book, go fishing. Do something just because you want to, not because it needs doing. And if the cooperative falls apart, then I'll help you rebuild it the day after. His smile was warm. But it won't. You've built something stronger than you realize. Mara took the next day off, though it felt strange and vaguely transgressive. She slept until the sun was well up, ate a leisurely breakfast, and spent the afternoon by the creek with a book Mrs. Granger had lent her. The world didn't end. The cooperative continued functioning, and when she returned to work the following day, she felt more rested than she had in months. It became a pattern. One day a week, Mara did something for herself rather than the work. Sometimes she rode her mare just for the pleasure of it, with no destination or purpose beyond enjoying the movement and the land. Sometimes she had dinner with the Brennan family, watching Mary's children play and remembering what normal life looked like. Sometimes she simply sat on her porch and watched the sun set, letting herself feel grateful for what she'd found. And sometimes Nathan joined her, his presence comfortable and undemanding, their conversation ranging from ranch business to philosophy to comfortable silence. It was during one of these evenings, as autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, that Nathan finally said what had been building between them for months. I'm in love with you. The words were simple, direct, offered without expectation or demand. Mara turned to look at him, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. That's complicated, she managed. Is it? Nathan's expression was calm, patient. Seems pretty straightforward to me. You're brilliant and brave and the most competent person I've ever met. You saved my ranch, built a cooperative that's changing how ranchers operate in this entire region, and somehow managed to make me believe in possibilities I'd given up on. How could I not love you? Because I'm your employee. Because people will say you're taking advantage, that I only got my position because of favoritism. Mara heard the fear in her own voice. Because if this goes wrong, I lose everything I've built here. Then we do it right. Nathan shifted to face her fully. I'm not asking you to be my mistress or my secret. I'm asking you to be my partner in business, in life, in building something that matters. We make it official, legal, equal. You keep your role in the cooperative, your house, your independence. Nothing changes except we stop pretending this is just professional respect. Everything changes, Mara corrected, but her voice was softer now. People will talk. Some of the cooperative members will question whether you're making decisions based on business or personal bias. We'll have to work twice as hard to maintain credibility. So we work twice as hard. We've both been doing that anyway. Nathan's smile was gentle. I'm not saying it'll be easy, Mara. I'm saying it'll be worth it. Mara thought about the girl who'd watched her father's ranch auctioned off, who'd learned to expect nothing from the world except hard work and harder losses. She thought about the woman who'd arrived at North Ridge expecting only temporary employment and the same old prejudices. And she thought about who she'd become in the months since, someone valued, respected, building something that mattered with people she cared about. Someone who'd learned slowly and painfully that not all trust led to betrayal. I love you too, she said quietly. I think I have for a while. It just scared me too much to admit it. And now? Now I'm still scared, but I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions. Mara took Nathan's hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength tempered by gentleness. So yes, partners, in everything. Nathan's kiss was soft and careful, asking rather than taking, and Mara felt something in her chest that had been locked tight for 3 years finally open. This wasn't rescue or salvation. It was partnership, freely chosen by two people who'd both learned the hard way that trust was earned and kept was precious. They were married in October, a small ceremony attended by the cooperative's members and the North Ridge crew. Mary Brennan stood up with Mara, while Tom Wardell served as Nathan's witness. Cooper gave a gruff toast about stubborn people finding each other and making the rest of them look bad. Danny grinned through the whole thing like he'd personally arranged their happiness. The cooperative members gave their blessing, though Mara insisted on a formal review of her role to ensure no one could claim favoritism. The review confirmed what everyone already knew. She was the best person for the job, married to the boss or not. Mrs. Granger cried through the ceremony and the reception, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief and declaring that she'd known from the start they were meant for each other. Mara moved into the main house, though she kept her small house as an office where she could work without distraction. She continued managing the cooperative, now with Mary as full partner rather than assistant. They hired 2 clerks to handle routine paperwork, freeing both women to focus on strategy and growth. The cooperative expanded to 20 ranches by the following spring, its success attracting attention from across the territory. Other regions began forming similar alliances, using the model Mara had created as a template. She found herself writing articles for agricultural journals, speaking at gatherings, becoming known as someone who understood both the practical and political dimensions of cooperative organization. It was gratifying and occasionally overwhelming, but she'd learned to pace herself, to accept that she couldn't personally solve every problem. She'd learned to delegate, to trust others, to let go of the belief that everything would fall apart if she wasn't constantly vigilant. She'd learned, slowly and with Nathan's patient support, how to be happy. Samuel Garrett remained a presence in their lives, though a diminished one. The cooperative's success had eroded his power base, and the threat of exposure kept him from the most blatant, predatory practices. He still controlled the bank, still had influence, but he'd learned to be more careful. The Territorial Banking Commission had begun paying attention to complaints, and Garrett couldn't afford another investigation. It wasn't perfect justice. Mara sometimes lay awake thinking about all the families Garrett had destroyed, knowing he'd never truly pay for those crimes. But it was something. The man who'd taken her father's ranch, who'd driven James Brennan to suicide, who'd ruined countless lives in pursuit of profit, that man had been stopped, at least partially, and the people he'd tried to destroy had built something better in the ruins he'd left behind. 2 years after their wedding, on a crisp autumn morning that reminded Mara of the day she'd first arrived at North Ridge, she stood with Nathan on the porch of their home, watching the sunrise paint the valley in shades of copper and gold. Her hand rested on her stomach, where their first child grew, and Nathan's arm was warm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "That my father would be proud." Mara's voice was thick with emotion. He always said ranching was about building something that lasted, creating value that went beyond yourself. I think this is what he meant. You've built something remarkable, Mara, something that will outlast both of us. We've built it, she corrected. The cooperative, the ranch, this life. None of it would exist without both of us. It was true. Northridge had become more than a ranch. It was the heart of a network of family operations that supported each other, protected each other, proved that cooperation was stronger than competition. The cooperative now included 30 ranches, employed dozens of people, and had successfully blocked 3 more of Garrett's attempted foreclosures. More importantly, it had given people hope. Mary Brennan's children would grow up on their mother's ranch, learning the skills their father had died trying to preserve. The Chen family had expanded their operation, proving that sheep and cattle ranchers could work together. Small operators who'd been living season to season now had stability, security, a future. And Mara herself had gone from dispossessed orphan to respected businesswoman, from hired hand to equal partner in an enterprise that mattered. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks and struggles, times when the cooperative's survival seemed uncertain, moments when old fears threatened to overwhelm new confidence. But they'd persevered, supported by people who believed in what they were building. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathan asked. "Taking the job that day? Everything that followed?" Mara thought about the scared, angry woman who'd roped that runaway steer, who'd been so certain that Northridge would be just another temporary stop in a life of constant motion. She thought about all the moments between then and now, the broken ribs, the confrontation with Garrett, the terrifying leap into trusting that good things could last. "Not for a second," she said. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Down in the valley, the ranch was coming to life. Hands were moving toward the corrals, smoke was rising from the bunkhouse stove, cattle were lowing in the distance. It was the beginning of another day, ordinary and precious in its ordinariness. Mara had spent 3 years running from loss, convinced that attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. She'd learned to survive, but had forgotten how to live, had traded hope for the cold comfort of low expectations. Northridge had changed that. Nathan had changed that. The community they'd built together had proven that trust, carefully given and faithfully kept, could create something stronger than any individual effort. She thought about the child growing inside her, about the world they'd bring that child into. It wouldn't be perfect. Garrett still owned the bank, injustice still existed. The work of building a fair community was never finished. But it would be better than the world Mara had inherited. And their child would grow up knowing that ordinary people, working together with courage and principle, could challenge power and win. That legacy was worth more than all the land or money in the territory. "Come on," Nathan said, gently tugging her toward the door. "Mrs. Granger made breakfast, and you know how she gets when we're late." Mara laughed and let herself be led inside, into the warmth and light and the life they'd built together. Behind her, the sun continued its rise, spilling gold across the valley, illuminating Northridge Ranch and all the land around it. It was, she thought, the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. Not because the land was perfect, but because it was home. Because she'd stopped running and started building, stopped surviving and started living. Because she'd learned, finally, that some rules were made to be broken, and that breaking them could lead to something far better than she'd ever dared to dream. Years later, when people asked Mara Cole Hale how she'd built the Oregon Ranchers Cooperative, how she'd gone from orphaned ranch hand to one of the most influential women in the territory, she always told the same story. She told them about a runaway steer and a rope that flew true, about a man who offered her double wage when others saw only liability, about choosing courage over fear, partnership over isolation, principle over expedience. She told them about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they refused to accept that the world couldn't be better. And she told them that the most important lesson she'd ever learned was simple. You were never as powerless as circumstances made you feel, never as alone as fear insisted you were, and never too broken to build something worth keeping. The rest, she said with a smile, was just hard work and stubbornness. But sitting on her porch in the evening, watching her children play in the yard while Nathan worked nearby, and the cooperative's latest newsletter reported another successful negotiation, another member ranch saved from foreclosure, another victory for the community they'd built. Sitting there, Mara knew it was more than that. It was proof that hope, tended carefully and defended fiercely, could grow into something real and lasting. It was proof that she'd found what she'd stopped believing existed, a place where she belonged, work that mattered, people who valued her for who she was rather than tolerated her despite it. It was proof that the girl who'd lost everything could become the woman who built something worth having. And that, Mara thought, as the sun set and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, was the greatest victory of all.